Hello, it's John Heaton, and I'm in London, and the weather's a bit cooler here. In fact, it's threatening to rain. It has been raining, but I thought we'd risk doing this video. I just want to do a review of Rolling Stones' Beggars Banquet. And one of the reasons I'm doing this review is because for the last few years, I'd mislaid my copy, or I'd lent it to a friend or something, disappeared from my collection. And as you probably know, the new vinyl has substituted what was intended to be the original cover with the graffiti on the lavatory wall. And so this original artwork is actually quite hard to find. So I was pretty pleased to pick up a US copy. So this album came out in the back end of '68, just to put it in context, very shortly after the Beatles' White Album. And I think one can recognise the similarity in the sleeves, which had been a kind of hallmark of Beatles and Stones records for a few years, with Satanic Majesties and then Let It Bleed followed in '69, which was obviously a parody on the title Let It Be, which actually hadn't come out at the time but had been recorded. So, but anyway, I'm gonna be honest here and say I prefer this cover. I think the graffiti cover is a little bit unpleasant to look at. I can see the point that they were trying to make, and they were pissed off that the record company refused to let them release it, so that's why they substituted it on the new release and on the CD release. But I like this minimalist cover, and with the metallic writing in the Beggars Banquet, RSVP, Respondez vous si vous plaît, and then a great picture in the gatefold of the Stones. The original lineup at the time of Mick, Keith, Charlie, Bill and Brian Jones. And Brian Jones is seen here with the dog, and he was to die within about 6 or 7 months of this album coming out, so quite sad. He did contribute to this album. One can hear his trademark slide guitar, but I think his influence was waning, and I think it was even on a couple of tracks on Let It Bleed, but his best days were probably behind him. But he appeared with them on the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus in December of '68, around about the time of this album's release, with John and Yoko, Eric Clapton and others. So this is an original US copy, and it's on the, I think it's a US copy, on the London label here. It does say made in England though, but this is in pretty good condition, and it looks to me like either a first pressing or a second pressing. But anyway, so I think this album is an important Stones album, and I think it's fair to say that at the time of the release of this album, the Beatles and the Stones were almost as influential as each other. In fact, there was quite a controversy going down at the time as to who was the more revolutionary band, the Beatles or the Stones. And I remember some criticism of the White Album, or I remember reading some criticism of the White Album saying it was just escapist, and the Stones were the ones who dealt with reality, and dealt with the revolution and how to deal with it, instead of writing escapist songs like Bungalow Bill or Rocky Raccoon. But I think in '68, as a fan, one would have been delighted to have the White Album and this album within a couple of weeks of each other. Absolutely delighted. In the same way as in 1970, one would have been spoilt with All Things Must Pass and Layla by Derek and the Dominoes and Plastic Ono Band from Lennon, all within a couple of weeks of each other. So anyway, back to '68. Mick Jagger was attending rallies and stuff. This was the summer of '68, just gone before, with all kinds of riots throughout Europe and protests against the Vietnam War and stuff. It was reaching a peak, that kind of thing. And Jagger turned up to one rally, and then pretty soon he was mobbed by the fans, so he thought, well, screw this for a lark, I'm not going to do that. And I think that's what's inspired the track Street Fighting Man. What can a poor boy do except to play in a rock and roll band? There's just no place for a street fighting man. So that's quite an honest song and a very effective song. But I better start off with Simply for the Devil, because this is probably one of their most famous tracks and one of their best tracks, and superb guitar, and mainly an acoustic song, but with a superb electric guitar solo. I'm not quite sure who did it. I'm assuming it's Keith. And the great backing vocals on this track. It's just a masterpiece, and the percussion, the way it builds up. And there was a film made, I forget what the name of it was, but there was a film you could see which showed them recording this song in the studio. It's absolutely fascinating. Maybe, if one's honest, a slightly provocative lyric, and may have contributed towards what ultimately happened at Altamont the following year, when the Hells Angels killed a member of the crowd. I personally think it was legitimate to write a song like this. I wasn't offended or anything, but I think they were flirting with danger putting out a song like this, because some people might have interpreted it the wrong way, in the same way that Charles Manson interpreted a pretty innocent song like Piggies and went around murdering people as a result. So anyway, a masterpiece, and great musicianship. No Expectations is a great ballad. Just want to check who wrote it. Yeah, it's Jagger Richards, although it's based on normal blues chords. It's similar to Love in Vain from the Let It Bleed album. An absolutely wonderfully sung by Mick, very atmospheric, and again, nice acoustic song with some lead work in there as well. It's actually mainly an acoustic album, this, if one thinks about it. There's not any rockers as such, like Honky Tonk Woman or anything. I guess Stray Cat Blues is the closest. And it's worth pointing out that preceding this album was a wonderful single called Jumping Jack Flash, which I suppose could have been included on this album, but at the time it was customary not to include singles on albums, and so that was not on this album, and Honky Tonk Woman was not on Let It Bleed. One can argue about that either way. Dear Doctor is next, a kind of country pastiche with some amusing vocals from Mick going into falsetto and playing the part of the female who doesn't want to marry the man, and quite amusing. Not a heavyweight song by any means, but fits well on this album. Parachute Woman is a kind of blues number with some great blues guitar work from, I assume, mainly Keith. I'm not actually sure what Brian contributed to this album. Maybe someone can write in the comments if they know more, but I'm assuming that most of the guitar work was from Keith on this album, with a few exceptions perhaps. I think Jigsaw Puzzle might be one of the exceptions, because there's some really nice slide guitar, and I'm again assuming it might be Brian doing that, but maybe could have been either. I'm happy to stand corrected. Wonderful picture, as I said, of them at the Beggars Banquet and Mick's eating an apple. Is that symbolic of the Apple Empire of the Beatles, perhaps? Probably not. So side 2 opens with Street Fighting Man, which I've talked about. It's another tour de force, and it found its way onto the compilation Through the Past Darkly, and just a wonderful song, atmospheric of the time, the '68 riots, and this is one of the Stones' most influential and most memorable songs, in my opinion. And then Prodigal Son is probably continuing or starting the tradition of Mick sounding pretty inaudible, and you can't really hear the words he's singing, but it's quite amusing. Nice acoustic number. Stray Cat Blues is a very strong rocking number, and this was done very effectively on the Get Your Ya-Ya's Out live album, and it's a highlight of the album for me. Then we got Factory Girl, Wait for the Factory Girl, brilliant, love it. Again, an acoustic driven number. Salt of the Earth is notable for Keith singing the opening 2 lines and then Mick coming in and completing it. And also worth noting is, and it's a nice song, and also worth noting is Nicky Hopkins plays keyboards on a lot of this album, and he'd also contributed piano on to the Beatles' Revolution, so it really was quite a small circle musically in London at the time. They were all, Billy Preston would play on Beatles sessions and then go and play on Stones albums as well, so quite like that aspect of it. It's produced by Jimmy Miller, who would produce this album through all the other albums up until Exile, and also produced the first few Traffic albums. Recorded at Olympic Studios, which is in Barnes, quite close to where I'm sitting here in Wimbledon actually. And Glyn Johns was another engineer, and another example of the small world, because Glyn Johns, a month or 2 after this album, would go and help with the Let It Be sessions with the Beatles. So this is a brilliant album, and it's in pretty good condition. A bit of a coffee stain there on the front, but it's up there in their top 3 or 4 albums for sure. It's a masterpiece. Thank you for watching. See you next time.